Have you ever wondered about the untold stories of the Indigenous children of Canada? What if I told you they were part of a long history of residential schooling? From the early 19th century until the mid-20th century, residential schools were a significant part of Canada's educational landscape. These institutions, often established in remote areas, were designed to assimilate Indigenous children into mainstream society by stripping them of their native cultures and languages. Among these, the Spanish Indian residential schools in Ontario hold a significant place in history. The Spanish Indian residential schools, operating from 1913 to 1965, were unique in many ways. These schools, one for boys and one for girls, were run by the Jesuit fathers and the Daughters of the Heart of Mary, respectively. They were the only residential schools in Canada to be operated by these religious orders. This fact alone sets them apart, but there's more to their story. These schools weren't just established on a whim. There was a long history leading up to their creation. Rooted in the earlier Jesuit-run day school at Wikwemkong First Nation, there were trials and tribulations, fires and relocations, and finally the decision to move both schools to Spanish Ontario. This move was spurred by a desire for increased accessibility thanks to Spanish's proximity to the railway. The boys' school, known as St. Peter Claver School, and the girls' school, known as St. Joseph's School, collectively formed the largest residential school in Ontario. They were more than just schools. They were entire communities with their barns, stables, machine sheds, sawmills, and storage buildings. They were home to hundreds of Indigenous children, shaping their lives in ways unimaginable. As we embark on this journey of discovery, let's remember that every story we uncover is part of a larger narrative. A narrative of resilience, strength, and survival. A narrative that is still being written today, as we continue to grapple with the legacy of residential schools in Canada. Together, let's delve into the past and uncover the history of the largest residential school in Ontario. The roots of the Spanish Indian residential schools go back to the early 19th century. In the year 1838, the Jesuits, a Catholic religious order known for their commitment to education, established a day school at Wikwemkong First Nation. This was the humble beginning of a journey that would eventually lead to the establishment of the Spanish Indian residential schools. As the years passed, the Jesuits expanded their educational efforts. In 1862, they opened the Wikwemkong Industrial School, Girls Department. This was followed by the Boys Department, which opened its doors in 1878, with assistance from the Canadian government. However, the journey was not without its hurdles. In 1885, both schools were tragically destroyed by fire, but the Jesuits were undeterred. They rebuilt the schools, demonstrating their unwavering commitment to the education of First Nations, Metis, and Anishinaabe children. In the late 19th century, the Canadian government approved the Wikwemkong School for funding through the residential school system. However, a labor dispute in the early 20th century led the Jesuits to make a significant decision. They decided to move the boys' department to Spanish Ontario, a location with increased accessibility due to its proximity to the railway. But the move to Spanish was not just for the boys' department. In 1911, a fire tragically consumed the girls' school at Wikwemkong. This unfortunate event, coupled with the decision to move the boys' department, led to the relocation of both schools to Spanish in 1913. These schools, operated by the Jesuit Fathers and the Daughters of the Heart of Mary, would collectively form the Spanish Indian Residential Schools, the largest residential school in Ontario. The schools were a testament to the tireless efforts of these religious orders to provide education to the Indigenous children of Canada. The relocation of the schools to Spanish Ontario in 1913 marked a significant turn in the history of residential schooling. The St. Peter Claver School for boys was unique in its operation. This one-of-a-kind institution found its home in Spanish Ontario, and was the only residential school in Canada to be run by the Jesuit order. Nestled on the north shore of Lake Huron, the school was a sprawling complex set on a 600-acre site. A large, imposing three-story stone building served as the main school, surrounded by outbuildings that included a barn, stable, machine sheds, a sawmill, and storage buildings. It was not just a school in the traditional sense, but a self-contained community housing 180 boys. The school's location near the railway provided increased accessibility, a key factor in its establishment in Spanish Ontario. This was a place where boys learned, lived, and grew within the confines of an institution that was part of a larger controversial residential school system. In 1947, the Garnier High School, also known as Garnier College, was established within the premises of St. Peter Claver School. The name Garnier was chosen to honor St. Charles Garnier, one of the Canadian martyrs. This high school within a school brought a new dimension to the educational offerings of the institution, adding another layer to its unique identity. For administrative purposes, St. Peter Claver School and Garnier High School were considered as one entity, and together, they operated under the name Spanish Indian Residential School. This consolidation of schools within a school was a hallmark of the Jesuit order's approach to education. The St. Peter Claver School for Boys, with its unique operation and layered educational system, played a significant role in the history of residential schools in Canada. However, despite its historical significance, its legacy remains largely unknown. This school, like many others of its kind, is a chapter in the larger narrative of Canada's relationship with its First Nations, Metis, and Anishinaabe children. Its story, though hidden in the shadows of the past, continues to resonate in the present. Despite the school's historical significance, its legacy remains largely unknown. Parallel to the boys' school was the girls' school, known as the St. Joseph's School. This institution, nestled on a 400-acre plot, was a stone's throw away from the St. Peter Claver School in Spanish Ontario. The relocation of the school to this location took place in 1913, although the construction of St. Joseph's didn't conclude until the following year. In a unique setup, the Daughters of the Heart of Mary led the operations of the St. Joseph's School. This order was the only one of its kind in Canada to run a residential school. The Daughters of the Heart of Mary, with their unwavering commitment to education and care, nurtured the girls of St. Joseph's, immersing them in a world of knowledge and compassion. However, the school's story was not without its share of dark days. In 1918, a devastating flu epidemic swept across the globe, sparing no corner of the world, and St. Joseph's School was no exception. The epidemic claimed the lives of 8 innocent girls at the school, casting a long, dark shadow over the institution. This tragic event left an indelible mark on the school's history, a sorrowful reminder of the vulnerability of life. Despite the heart-wrenching events of 1918, the school continued its operations, striving to provide its students with the best possible education and care. Yet, all stories must come to an end, and St. Joseph's School was no different. On the 30th of June 1962, the school closed its doors for the last time, marking the end of an era. In 1981, a fire ravaged the girls' school building, leaving behind only a shell of its former glory. This shell, standing tall in Spanish Ontario, serves as a silent testament to the school's legacy, a monument to its past. The closing of St. Joseph's School in 1962 marked the end of an era. The school, with its unique history, will forever remain a part of Canada's rich tapestry, a poignant reminder of a time gone by. The Spanish Indian residential schools left a lasting impact on the Indigenous community. The school's closure marked the end of a chapter, but it hardly signified the end of a narrative that had been etched deep into the hearts and memories of the Indigenous community. The aftermath was just as significant, if not more so, than the years the institutions were in operation. After the girls' school shut its doors in June of 1962, life didn't simply return to normal. The echoes of the past resonated through the halls of the now silent buildings. In 1981, a fire ravaged the girls' school building, leaving nothing but a shell of its former self. The shell still stands today in Spanish Ontario, a stark reminder of the institution that once stood there, and the lives it shaped. But what is the legacy of these schools? To answer that, we must delve into the heart of the residential schooling system in Canada. The Spanish Indian Residential Schools, the largest residential school in Ontario, were just one part of a network of institutions aimed at assimilating Indigenous children into mainstream Canadian society. The school's legacy is a complex one, marred by the harsh realities of cultural assimilation, loss of language and identity, and the systemic mistreatment of Indigenous children. Yet it's also a story of resilience. Despite the adversity faced by the Indigenous community, they have persevered, maintaining their cultural identities and working tirelessly to heal and rebuild. The story of the Spanish Indian residential schools isn't just a tale of hardship, but also one of survival and resistance. The schools may have closed their doors, but the lessons they imparted, both intentional and otherwise, continue to shape the discourse around Indigenous rights and the history of residential schooling in Canada. The story of the Spanish Indian residential schools is a testament to the resilience of the Indigenous community in the face of adversity. The journey through the history of the Spanish Indian residential schools brings us to deep reflection. We've traversed the landscape of time, from the early establishment of the schools in Spanish Ontario, to the closure of these institutions in the mid-20th century. We've learned about the unique role the Jesuit fathers and the Daughters of the Heart of Mary played in the operation of the boys' and girls' schools respectively, a distinction that sets the Spanish Indian residential schools apart from others in Canada. We've explored the grounds of the St. Peter Claver School, the only residential school in Canada operated by the Jesuit Order, and the St. Joseph's School, the only one run by the Daughters Order. We've walked the corridors of history, pausing to acknowledge the hardships endured by the First Nations, Metis, and Anishinaabe children who were students at these schools. We've looked back at the tragic loss of life during the 1918 flu epidemic, a dark chapter in the annals of St. Joseph's School. We've discovered how these schools, despite their challenging past, served as the backdrop for the establishment of Garnier College, a high school which honored St. Charles Garnier, one of the Canadian martyrs. The Spanish Indian residential schools were not just educational institutions, they were a microcosm of the larger struggle of Indigenous communities in Canada, a testament to their endurance and fortitude in the face of adversity. The Spanish Indian residential schools, the largest residential school in Ontario, have left an indelible mark on Canadian history. Their story, both somber and inspiring, is a testament to the resilience of the Indigenous community, a legacy that continues to echo through the ages. As we continue to uncover the untold stories of the past, we are reminded of the resilience and strength of the Indigenous community. This is a legacy that should never be forgotten.